Hey, welcome to Social Studies Lesson 5. And today we're going to continue building our skills as geographers and learning how to read maps. But we're going to focus in specifically on a map of North America and the way that looked before it became the United States of America. We're going to look at the land with Native American culture and regions in mind, okay? So we're taking it a step further here. We're going to think about how Native Americans have lived around North America and in Missouri specifically. We're going to read a book today, and this is going to be broken up into 2 days. So we're not going to finish the book during this lesson here today. And then we're going to look at different regions across the country. All right, so let's get started with our book. Now, this book is called A River Ran Wild, and I had plans on reading this with you in class, and we didn't get to do that. So bear with me as I try to make this as exciting as I can, teaching you about Native American tribes through this read aloud, which I love, but also I'm going to have to go through and talk about a lot of characteristics of Native American regions today. But don't worry, you won't need to have them memorized. All right, so A River Ran Wild by Lynn Cherry, an environmental history. Okay, so we're actually going to be looking at a tribe along the Nashaway River Valley, so not here in Missouri, but we still can think about and notice how a Native American tribe might live and find success and flourish along a river valley, okay? As I read this first page, I want you to notice the picture and think about the characteristics of a river valley and why this river valley specifically might be a great place for people to live. Long ago, a river ran wild through a land of towering forests. Bears, moose, and herds of deer, hawks, and owls all made their homes in this peaceful river valley. Geese paused on their long migration and rested on its banks. Beavers, turtles, and schools of fish swam in its clear waters. What characteristics would you use to describe this river right now? One day, a group of native people searching for a place to settle came upon a river valley. From atop the highest mountain, known today as Mount Wachusett, they saw the river nestled in its valley, a silver sliver in the sun. They came down from the mountains, and at the river's edge they knelt to quench their thirst with its clear water. Pebbles shone up from the bottom. "Let us settle by this river," said the chief of the native people. He named the river Nashaway, river with the pebbled bottom. I wonder why this tribe is deciding to settle along this river. Let's see what the river has to offer them. By the Nashaway, Chief Wiowa's people built a village. They gathered cattails from the riverbanks to thatch their dwellings. You can see their houses in the background there. In the forest, they set fires to clear brush from the forest floor so they could clear space. In these clearings, they planted corn and squash for eating. They made arrows for hunting and canoes for river travel. Now, this looks very similar to Jamestown in the Chesapeake Bay of Virginia. There, where the Wampanoags lived, it looked very similar to this, and that's the same region. When the Indians hunted in the forest or caught salmon in the river, they killed only what they needed for themselves, for food and clothing. They asked all the forest creatures that they killed to please forgive them. The Nashaway people saw a rhythm in their lives and in the seasons. The river, land, and forest provided all that they needed. Now, if you take a moment to look around the border of the text on the left side, you can see all things that they used from the river and their land. Okay, so they've carved a wooden bowl, they've figured out how to make clay pots, there's woven baskets, I see a belt, lots of zucchini and squash, different utensils for cooking and eating. Oh, look, antler. It said they used the entire animal they'd use everything they needed. So antler, they made tools out of deer antler. That's fascinating. All right, I am going to read you the next page to give you a glimpse into what we're going to be talking about tomorrow, but then we're going to get back to the slideshow. This is where we're going to stop today. The Nashaway had lived for generations by the clear, clean, flowing river when one day a pale-skinned trader came with a boatload full of treasures. He brought shiny metal knives, colored beads, and cooking kettles, mirrors, tools, and bolts of bright cloth. His wares seemed like magic. The Nashaway welcomed him, traded furs, and soon a trading post was built. Does this sound similar to any other stories we've heard about? Reminds me of Encounter with Christopher Columbus and the Taino Native Americans. All right, so now I'm going to get back to our slideshow, and there's a couple of things you'll have to answer about this book when you are working on your assignment today. All right, so thinking about A River Ran Wild and the first part we've read today, you're going to be asked to list 3 to 5 characteristics that describe the river at the beginning of the story and when the Native Americans encounter the river. That counts too. Second, I want you to think about what are the benefits of Native Americans settling near a river like this? And third, how do the natives interact with the natural resources around them? How do they interact with the natural resources around them? All right. So now that we've learned a little bit more about maps and location, we're going to use that information to discuss the locations of different regions, different Native American regions. We will also learn more about the nations and the tribes, but today we're specifically going to focus on the regions and how Native Americans had to live a certain type of way to do well and flourish in that region. All right. So I'm sure you're familiar with this map you see. I mean, maybe not the Native American tribes, but the shape of the map, because this is present day United States of America. That's a country inside the continent of North America. So we're focusing in on Native American, but when I talk about Native Americans today, some of the tribes I talk about span all the way up into Canada and Mexico, all of North America. But again, our job is to really focus in on what we know now today as the United States of America. So if you notice, I'll be looking at the camera, at the slideshow a little bit, but I also have some notes that I got from history.com that I'm going to be reading to you, which is on my phone on a stand right above my laptop. So my eyes will sometimes be looking up, and that's what I'm looking at. All right, so many thousands of years before Christopher Columbus's ships landed in the Bahamas, a different group of people discovered America, and we knew this. Listen to this. The nomadic ancestors of modern Native Americans who hiked over a land bridge from Asia into what is now known as Alaska more than 12,000 years ago. We've heard about that, hiking over that land bridge, moving over that land bridge from the book Coming to America. Do you remember that? We started asking questions about Native American movement when we read that book. By the time European adventurers arrived in North America, scholars estimate that more than 50 million Native Americans already called North America home. Out of those 50 million, 10 million, it is said that, or estimated that 10 million of those Native Americans lived in what we know today as the United States of America. I thought that was fascinating. That's a huge number of people living here in North America, or in the United States of America. So in order to keep track of these diverse groups of people that lived here in the United States of America, archaeologists and anthropologists and geographers have grouped people together based on how they lived and where they lived, noticing the characteristics of how and where they lived. So they divided them up into cultural regions. Typically, when you're looking up Native American cultural regions, you'll see these 10 regions, and they're not exactly the same as you can see here on our map. But it's typically the Arctic, the subarctic region, the Northeast, the Southeast, the Plains, the Southwest, the Great Basin, California, and the Northwest Coast and the Plateau. Okay, you're not going to have to remember all these, but I am going to talk about characteristics from each of these regions. So Native Americans lived differently based on where they lived. So now I've just added this text box, and we're going to look at the land to the east, to the right of my text box, but the east coast of North America. All right, so if you look over here, we've got the eastern woodlands, also known as the northeast region, and the southeast region down below. Let's start up here. Now this is first where European settlers started coming in, and so these Native Americans in the woodland in the northeast region, they are some of the natives that had first interactions with European settlers. Okay, so this region spans from Canada's Atlantic coast down to North Carolina here, and inland all the way to the Mississippi River Valley. I'm using a new way to record today, and I don't know if you can see my arrow, but I hope you do. So the River Valley is the border with the yellow and the blue on either side. So if you were a Native American living in the Northeast region, you probably would settle along inland rivers and lakes. Native American Indians in this region had stable villages, some along in small farming areas or fishing villages along the ocean. In this area, they were known for growing crops like corn, beans, and vegetables. Now down below in this pink area, the southeast region, it's more humid and it's a fertile agricultural region. Fertile means that it is good for growing crops. There are expert farmers in this region. They grew staple crops like maize, corn, beans, squash, tobacco, and sunflower. Many organized their lives around small ceremonial and market villages. These were known as hamlets. Okay. So next, we're going to look at the West Coast, so the opposite side, and we're skipping over the Midwest for right now, because that's the one that's most important for us here in Missouri that we need to learn about as third graders. All right, so in this region, we've got the Plateau, the Northwest Coast, California, Southwest, Great Basin. We're going to talk about 3 of those regions now. So the Plateau region, this blue area, that's a region known for small, peaceful villages along streams and riverbanks. Native Americans in this region survived by fishing for salmon and trout, hunting and gathering wild berries, roots, and nuts. Now, the Northwest Coast is quite similar, except their region is touching the ocean, so they're going to use the ocean for their resources. This is a mild climate year-round and is abundant with natural resources. Since the ocean is near, this region's rivers and ocean provided salmon. And salmon is delicious, and they get lots of it. Also whales, sea otters, seals, and fish, and shellfish of all kinds. Lots of seafood in this area. Now, if you went over to the Great Plains or the Southwest, you're not going to have that. You can't see it on this map, but because this is just a map of the United States, what we know as the United States. But below the orange and green regions is Mexico. And so some of these tribes spread out into Mexico as well. Okay, now the California region. It looks like the state of California today. This is a very diverse region. It's estimated that 100 different tribes and groups lived in this area, speaking more than 200 dialects. So it must have been really hard to communicate. They had all these different dialects and different words for things. There's little to no agriculture in this area because it's quite rocky. Instead, groups of Native Americans organized themselves into small family-based bands of hunters and gatherers and moved a little bit more. Now, the Plateau and the Northwest Coast and the Great Basin, they were pretty lucky. They had a lot of what they needed right there for them because they could plant, they could get their fish, they could get the whales and the seals to use for many different things. So they were pretty settled. They didn't have to pack up and move around a lot. Sounds like in California and more to the Midwest and the Great Plains region, there was a lot more movement. And we're going to talk about why here in a second. Before I get into the Great Plains, I did want to talk about the Arctic and subarctic regions. So I had to change maps because the last map, look, shows Alaska down below. And that's not really where Alaska is located, but it's often how we fit Alaska into Native American maps. All right, So, or not Native American maps, maps of the United States. The Arctic region is mainly what we know today as Alaska and parts of Canada, but it's a cold, flat, treeless region. It's actually a frozen desert. And the tribes that were living in this Arctic region were typically spread out, and comparatively, this region is quite small. So, compared to the other regions we just looked at, there's not nearly as many people living in this region 12,000 years ago, hundreds of years ago, because it's so hard to live there. They were nomadic tribes living in this region. That means they followed seals, polar bears, and other game as they migrated across the tundra. So when you hear me say nomadic, it means they move about. And there are some small fishing villages. So one of the tribes is called the Tlingit, and they probably lived in this area that looks really blue, but that's all Alaska. And it's so blue because there's so many inland waterways that come into the land. This is like where Juneau, Alaska is. So that Tlingit tribes probably had small fishing villages. But then as you got further in, or further up into Alaska, there might have been a tribe called the Inuit. You might have heard of them. And then the subarctic region is further east into Canada. And then that's part of that region's like the taiga, which is like swampy, but cold, forested areas. Okay, so that's the subarctic region. Now, your goal today, let me go to the next slide. Your goal today is not to memorize these regions, but I hope that you think about who lived in these lands that we live before today. You might ask yourself, what tribes still live in certain areas of the United States of America? You might ask yourself, how did Native Americans lose this land? Were there any peaceful compromises? Was anybody able to keep their land? Or was every interaction as devastating to Native American culture as we've heard in many stories? Now, I know that my class and Miss Jaber's class, we questioned when we were reading the book Coming to America, was there ever a way for Native Americans and European settlers to have peaceful compromise? So keep that question in mind, and we're going to talk more about European interaction with all of these tribes as they start moving west tomorrow, and when we read part 2 of A River Ran Wild. So let's talk about the Great Plains tribes now and Native Americans in our current location. So in the Great Plains, it's a vast prairie region between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, so where the blue meets the yellow, all the way over to the other side of the yellow region here. That's the Great Plains. And it spanned from present-day Canada, so up north, down to the Gulf of Mexico, okay? This was relatively settled with hunters and farmers. And after European contact, especially after Spanish colonists came through this area because they introduced the Great Plains Native Americans to horses. After that, this region, the people in this region became much more nomadic. They started moving a lot more because they had the ability to with horses. It's Great Plains, so it's flat, and so the horseback riding was a great way for them to get around. It gave them a lot of power. The most common dwelling for these hunters is something that you probably get an image of when I say it, a teepee. That's probably something you're familiar with. And that's a cone-shaped home dwelling that they could quickly pack up and move with them, so they could move to another spot for good farming and hunting as soon as they needed it. And teepees were made out of bison skin, so they used buffalo to help build their homes, and they used every part of the buffalo. All right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about specifically Missouri. Here on this map, you guys can see that the borders of what we know the states to be today are listed on this map, and the last map did not have our state borders. This one does, okay? So the plains covers states like Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, okay? And you can see some of those Native American tribes. There are more Native American tribes than either of my maps shows. I just want to tell you that. But let's look specifically at Missouri. Okay, so a little bit about Missouri history. Before the Europeans' conquest and took over our land, Native Americans created a complex culture here in North America, in the Mississippi Valley, using corn production and trade for the development of their society. The largest center of the Mississippi culture is in Cahokia Mounds, or was called Cahokia, which you may have visited Cahokia Mounds. It's just right across the river in St. Louis. Now, this space, Cahokia, was thriving in the 10th through 14th centuries, and it had almost 20,000 inhabitants. That means 20,000 people about were living there, and it actually collapsed even before European settlers came through this way because of warfare and climatic changes, and also it was very hard and impossible to sustain with that many people living in one area. But that was a big, I guess, city, if you will, from that time. So the Mississippi Indian culture declined after Cahokia kind of went under, but Native Americans remained in this area and fed themselves by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. Okay, so the Missouri was the hunting ground for many different tribes. So if people weren't settled here on a trading area or a fishing village, they were kind of moving through this area and hunting. So 12,000 all the way to 14,000 years ago, it said that people were thriving in the land that we live on today. And that long ago, they were hunting huge mammals, right? Like mastodons. And then the Ice Age took that away. So after the Ice Age arrived and the disappearance of large mammals caused people in this area to start hunting smaller game and rely more heavily on gathering and foraging. In this area, they crafted fluted points for hunting, needles for making clothing, hand-woven nets for fishing, and mortars for crunching seeds. And it's fascinating if you go hiking in this area. I have a friend in my classroom who does a lot of hiking and has found quite a few arrowheads in this area. Some of them may date back to Native Americans living in this area and along our river valleys. So there's many tools and artifacts that you can still find here on this land. Fish and vegetables became an important part of their diet here. They learned how to fire clay pots and tools. They were a huge part of trade along the Mississippi River, and they created large ceremonial earthworks like Cahokia Mounds. Let's see. The Mississippi Imperial, I'm skimming over the notes I want to read to you guys. Sorry, I'm trying to wrap this up quick. Native Americans became highly dependent on rivers, eating river-dwelling animals, and growing crops in the fertile soil of the riverbeds. So the river remained really vital to them doing well. Corn, beans, squash, sunflower, and gourds were all grown here. Something that's really fascinating, there's an app that you can download on your phone called Native Lands. I have it on my phone. I would show it to you, but I'm using my phone. It's so cool. You can put in your coordinates or wherever you're located and find out who the land you're on belongs to. So what tribe owned that land. So my house where I live was actually part Osage land and part Miami land. Now Miami was a tribe that went from Missouri all the way over to Illinois, and Osage is a huge tribe through the Great Plains region. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. So check out that app and see where maybe your house is located. It's probably Osage and Miami like mine because I'm not far from you. But also as you travel or go about this summer, you can see where different places are around North America, whose land that is, which I think is just so cool. All right, Missouri is even named after a Native American word. Missouri means big muddy. You can see there's a tribe here in Missouri that was called Missouria. Okay. Tomorrow we'll learn more about these tribes you see here and what happened to them and what happened to their land. Okay? All right, guys, today's assignment, you are going to answer the 3 reflection questions that I read to you right when we finished part 1 of A River Ran Wild. And you're going to use a grid to find an exact location on a map. I know today's video was really long. Remember, you don't have to memorize this all, but I do want you to think about where Native American people lived in what we know today as the United States of America. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.